Hi, this is Jim with CableSupply.com, and today I'm going to start a series, and the series is going to be on telecommunications, not networks, not computers, but we're going to start a little bit with history. We're going to start explaining a little bit about the telecommunications, and then we're going to talk a little bit about its background, some of the phrases that are used, some of the ideas that are still in place today. In fact, some of these ideas are used by our data friends when they put up local area networks and when they interact with the internet. You know, a lot has happened since Alexander Graham Bell created the telephone many years ago. When he called for Watson, he poured acid on his hand by accident and he said, "Watson, I need you, come here." A lot has happened since then, but a lot has remained the same since then. And if you remember, or if you've seen any pictures of old telephones and things like that, we're going to start looking at some of those old concepts that are still used today. The telecom industry has really changed a lot, yet at the same time it's stayed the same in a lot of areas. But for years, the telecom industry in America was pretty much owned by AT&T. It had the right, according to the US government, to be the supplier of voice communications in America for a very long time. And it was actually, if I believe right, it was actually started by Alexander Graham Bell many years ago. I think that was his company, AT&T, and it blew up to where one end of the country to the other was completely controlled by AT&T. And it controlled the rates, it controlled local access, it controlled telephone numbers, it controlled everything. And you could not do anything without their permission when it came to telecom. In fact, there was an interesting situation that happened in 1959. And that is Thomas Carter invented a thing called the Carter phone. And the Carter phone was an acoustic coupler that connected the telephone system with radios. One of the issues with Thomas Carter was that he had many oil wells out in Texas. And he'd go out to an oil well and he'd find out that, you know, it didn't completely fill up the reserve tank. So he created this little cartophone to help communicate with his people out in the field, also to communicate, telling him when this oil storage facility was filled and needed to be emptied. Well, what happened was AT&T didn't like that because it was connected to what they said was their network. I personally think they were wrong, because it's not their network, it was owned by the taxpayers and citizens of the United States. But to make a long story short, it went to court. 8 years later, the FCC decided that it was okay that Carter could attach his cartophone to the telephone system, because there was no way it could prove that that attachment to the telephone system hindered or in any way damaged that phone system. From AT&T. That started a revolution. What you had after that is you had answering machines, and then you had fax machines, and then you had modems, and you had a lot of other devices that were attached. And more AT&T fought a lot of this stuff. I remember once I was at my in-laws' house in Pennsylvania, and they asked me to hook up a telephone. I was already in telecom. I was working in the Marine Corps. Telecommunications, and I said, yeah, I'd be happy to hook up that phone. And I had to do something, I forget what it was, so many years ago. I had to do something, I had to talk to AT&T. And AT&T said, you can't hook up that phone. And I said, yes, I can. And then, no, it has to be an AT&T phone. I said, no, it does not. The FCC, I think it's Article 68, says that as long as it meets certain standards, you can hook up another device to the phone system. And I remember them getting really upset with me, probably because the local folks didn't know what the law was, and the law had recently changed at that point. But to make a long story short, AT&T has dragged its feet for years. And then came along another company called MCI, Microwave Communications Incorporated. And you know, it's kind of interesting, because from what I understand, Microwave Communications, MCI, was some military guys that what they did is they bought surplus military equipment, and they were 24 circuit T1 circuits used on microwave. And what they did is they connected the circuit up between DC and Baltimore. And they realized at that point there was a lot of phone calls going back and forth between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And there was a toll charged between the two cities, and it was kind of hefty. And so what they did is they set up this muck shot, it's what it's called, and it has big antennas, parabolic antennas, big round things that communicate back and forth for a couple hundred miles. And you could call into that MCI location, and if you put in a little code, you'd get dial tone at the other side, and then you'd dial a local number, and it was a lot less expensive than what AT&T charged back then. So they became very popular, and again, AT&T went back to court, said this is inappropriate. They were the only one licensed to do long distance, and at that point, the government broke up AT&T. And thank God they did, because if they didn't, you wouldn't have some of the features you have today, like the internet. See, when you're a monopoly, you do not have motivations to innovate. You don't have a motivation to cut your price, to become competitive. But as soon as they broke up AT&T, now you've got a bunch of competitiveness. You have a competitive instinct at that point, and it's either you provide a better service, a better product at a lower price, or we go to the competitor. And because of that, prices dropped. I remember as a kid calling from Philadelphia back to the West Coast, where I'm actually now, I live here, but we had family on the West Coast, and it would cost dollars per minute to make that phone call. Now, I call on my cell phone for free from one coast to the other. Competition lowers prices, and it gives you a better product, and it gives you innovation. Because if I can give you a better product than the person down the street, especially if I can give you a lower price, you'll buy from me. And because of that, we end up with the internet. We end up with all these features that has come out, automatic call distribution, call waiting. You could buy your own phone and hang it on the wall and use it yourself. And it could be different colors. I remember back when I was a kid, my mom got a yellow kitchen phone that was bolted to the wall, and we had to pay an extra $2 a month just to have yellow rather than black. Did it cost them any more to do yellow than black? No, but they made money on it. But you couldn't buy back then, back in the 60s. You couldn't buy a phone and connect it to the phone system. You had to have a phone that you got from AT&T, and it had to be rented from them. You had to pay a fee each month. So now the very same phone that we actually probably you could buy anywhere for under $100, back then we were paying $5, $6 a month, $5 for black, $6 for color, a month just to have that telephone. So a lot of things have changed over the years, but at the same time, a lot of things have remained the same. Now we're going to start talking about some technical issues that have remained the same. Let's take a look at what our phone system in America really is, okay? And we're just going to draw a little diagram here, and we're going to talk about some names, some things you need to know, acronyms, things like that you need to know about when you're dealing with the phone company. So if you're an IT guy and you got to order lines, this is a perfect time in the video for you to pay attention. And if you're a telephone installer, this is probably things you already know. But if you're an IT manager and you got to order lines, you got to determine how they, and explain how they work and everything else, this is some good background for you. So let's take a look at basic telephone. So what we have here is, this is your house. I mean, this is really basic, okay? And your house has lines going out to a telephone pole. And from the telephone pole, it goes to the company, phone company building. And of course, this wire comes down and you got your little telephone. Our little logo for telephone is a triangle with a half circle over top. Looks like a telephone, doesn't it? It's kind of cool, but that's always been a logo for telephones. And you're going to see later on when you look at some of the cabling videos that they use that triangle to signify a outlet, either a telephone or a computer outlet that's bolted into the wall. So and some of the things, and I know you're familiar with this, most likely 99.9% of the time this is going to be an analog telephone. And we're going to talk about the difference between analog and digital a little later and why it's significant and why it's something you should know about. But here is the phone company. Now, just remember that sometimes phone people use a phrase called CO. and that stands for central office, and that's referencing the phone company headquarters where the dial tone comes from, where the cable basically terminates. This is called right here, from here to the house, from the phone company or from a phone company box. Sometimes you see a little greenish cylinder box sitting on the side of the road. That's also sometimes, not always, but sometimes that's where you get your dial tone from, and that might be an actual CO. Sometimes they're large, 6 foot across, 4 foot high. Guy opens up, you'll see them there. Sometimes they have a little umbrella over them, and they're doing cabling work there and all. Sometimes that's called a CO also. It might also be called a B box. I don't know why they call it a B box. Maybe if you're a telephone guy working for AT&T, you can tell the rest of the world why they call that a B box. But this is the basics, so we're not going to go into every little detail about the telephone company. But this is what's called the last mile or the final loop. And usually at your house, you have a thing called loop start. You lift up the handset and you make a connection. So electronically, it's going to look like this. The equipment's going to be out there, and you're going to have a wire that goes out to your phone, and when you lift up the handset, these two connect, and you have now an electrical loop going back and forth, and that creates that signals the phone equipment to send you a dial tone, and that's called loop start line. So we've got a couple of things here. CO, the last mile. Sometimes we have high-speed cables that can make it to the CO, but there's not the right amount of cables going to your house to give you the bandwidth that you need when it comes to internet. And so there's a lot of problems with that last mile in our system in the US right now. But anyway, you pick up, you make a phone call, and you're able to dial out. And that's called a closing the loop on your loop start dial tone. That's really the basic dial tone, 64K. It's what sits in your house. It's an analog device. Loop start lines are also used in PBXs, but we'll talk about that a little later. PBXs, key systems, and also some other systems. It's used for modems and faxes and things like that. It's all analog. But it's still useful. A lot of people use it, be using it for the unforeseeable future, the same technology. So as we talk about telephones, what I brought was a really old telephone. It's called a Candlestick Telephone. Notice it doesn't even have dialers there. It's about 100 years old, sits in our lobby. Thought it'd be cool to show you. But I wanted to show you a couple things about this telephone. First of all, you remember the phrase where it says that you say to someone, hang up that phone? That's what they're talking about. And a lot of telecom terminology is from 50, 60, 100 years ago or more. Hang up the phone. Well, this little switch in here that hangs up the phone is also technically called a hook switch. And the reason why, it's kind of hard to see here because this is a fork. But even before the fork, they had what was called a, they had their little receiver you put up to your ear, in case you didn't know how this works. Put this up to your ear and you talk like this. But before they actually had the fork like that, they would have on the receiver side, they would have a little piece of wire here that would loop around. And then here they would actually have a hook that would stand out like that. So you would take this and you would connect it to the hook and you would hang up the phone. Well, we still call that in telecom, in the telecom world, we still call this a hook switch. Hangs up the phone, everything else, it signals the operator or the system that you want to make a phone call. Now, obviously, you can't dial with this. So what you actually have to do back then, and you should know this, is that when you picked up this line to talk, the operator on the operator console, and it was always manual back then with these phones, the operator would hear a little buzzer and they'd see a little light. Sometimes what would happen is there'd be a little ball in there and the ball was painted black, and then when you would pick up the line, the ball would rotate and it would be white, and they'd hear a buzzer, and they would have what's called a phone jack. And they would take this phone jack and they would look for that little indicator of who is off hook See that phrase again? And then they would plug in the phone jack, and the lady would have a little earpiece, and she would say, you know, "Hi Bob, how can I help you?" I mean, it was that personal years ago with the phone system. Not everyone had phones, let's say back in the 40s and 30s. So they actually had no dialing apparatus. They could just talk to the operator, and the operator would patch them through using a phone jack and a phone plug, you know. And you've seen sometimes on headsets where they have that little plug. It's kind of thick. If you really look at a real phone plug, it's not a thin thing. But that's how they would work. And then later on, what would happen is they decided that they invented a automatic switching system. So it would have a little dial there, and they added dials to these things, and they would dial it, and you would put your finger in, let's say, on 6, and you would take it all the way over, and then it would slowly go back, and it would click each time. And what that dialer was doing was it was opening and closing the contacts. You know, the contacts that we drew earlier, it was opening and closing those contacts. And the phone equipment back here at the CO could read that opening and closing and the time distance between the contacts. So it knew you were dialing. And if it heard 6 and then a pause, and then a 3 and a pause, and then a 5 and a pause, it would know as the numbers that you were dialing. Then it would connect you, so you would no longer need that operator who was sitting there at the operator location and wouldn't need to plug you in, and you can actually dial someone else. It became a little impersonal at that point, but a lot more proficient to have that type of dialing. And then years later, and I think it was like, oh gosh, late 60s, they came out what was called DTMF. And let me erase this. And it is DTMF, dual tone multi-frequency. I put P, sorry, MF, dual tone multi-frequency. And let me explain to you, let me show you what that actually is. Let's say this is your keypad. What they would be, obviously, when you look at it, and you're pretty familiar with this. This is on most phones these days. I guess I need to draw a little bit further. One, two, three, 4, 9. And this is star or pound, I forget which. Star, pound, and a 0. And of course the other is 5, 6, I'll just fill them in, 7, 8. And so, you know, obviously you'd push the buttons, you hear the tones, you know, something like that. And then those tones would be identified at the phone company's CO, and so they would know which number you were dialing, and they could properly route your call through where it needs to go. One thing you may not be aware of is that there's extra tones out here. Not buttons, but tones. And these tones are used within the system to communicate between COs. It's also used today in voicemail. So to light your message lighting, waiting light, some systems use these additional tones. But how this works is you have frequencies that start at the top, let's say, and I'm just going to make up these frequencies. You can actually look them up to see precisely what they are, but this is just an example, okay? So you'll have frequency 1, frequency 2, frequency 3, frequency 4, and then this way you would have frequency A, frequency B, frequency C, frequency D. So if you push, let's say, 1, you would hear the 2 frequencies, frequency 1 and A. And let's say if you push 9, well, 9 would be C and 3. And so there's your dual tones. One set of tones this way. It's an oscillator, so it just has one tone on this column, and it has a totally different tone up here. So it's called dual tone multi-frequency dialing and communications. And that's how the phone systems, even within the phone company, communicate with each other is using these tones. Now there's other ways they communicate too, and I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of what they called SS7 conversations amongst themselves, but this is pretty basic stuff that you need to know, and that's called dual tone multi-frequency. That's different than pulse dialing. Pulse dialing is the one where you dial it. You dial it over and over, you know, different numbers, and for you guys that are young, you probably never even seen that, but I remember as a kid always dialing, didn't think there was anything else different. What was interesting is when they came out with DTMF, the phone company would charge you extra money if you had a DTMF phone. They would charge you an extra $1 or $2 per month. But in reality, the less time you spend dialing, the more availability of their system is in use for other subscribers. So that's the dialing mechanism. Thank you for watching this installment in our telecommunications series. And it's based on 25 years experience that I have had running Nova voice and data systems. We started out as a cable company, then we did voice and data systems. From there on out, we've installed over 6,000 phone systems throughout the United States in every single state. And because of that, we started CableSupply.com. CableSupply.com is an e-commerce site that's designed by voice and data installers for installers. So if you're an installer, this is the site for you. And the reason why this is the site for you is we don't sell Hello Kitty or iPad cases or things like that. We only sell to your industry if you're an installer. We sell the parts and the equipment and the tools that you need to do your job better. Hi, this is Jim with CableSupply.com. Hi, this is Jim from CableSupply.com. Hi, this is Jim with CableSupply.com, and today I'm going to show you how to cut a hole in the drywall.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to this YouTube installment of CableSupply.com.